Welcome back to the Death Row and Executions channel, and thank you for watching. I'm Paco Rivera. First, I would like to wish everyone a Happy New Year, and I hope the best for all of you this year and those to come. Before we talk about Robert Fratta, let's quickly recap scheduled executions in 2022. Now, I'm just going to talk about the executions that were actively scheduled when the year began and that were added during the year. And there were exactly 30 of them. If you look at the actual Death Penalty Information Center data, there were over 50, but many of those had already received a stay of execution even before the year began, so I'm not counting those. In 2022, 30 executions were scheduled in 10 different states, 8 in Oklahoma and 8 in Texas, 4 in Alabama, 3 in Arizona, 2 in Missouri, and then Tennessee, South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, and Idaho each had one death row inmate scheduled for execution. So of the 30 executions scheduled, 18 were actually executed. 5 in Oklahoma, 5 in Texas, 3 in Arizona, which were all 3 that they had scheduled, 2 in Alabama, 2 in Missouri, and 1 in Mississippi. Receiving temporary stays of execution, with the stays resulting for different reasons, either because the governor or a court issued an order for it, or the execution was halted for other reasons. Remember that none of these inmates had their death sentence commuted, such as in the case of Julius Jones in 2021, whose death sentence was commuted to life without parole. And none of these inmates had their sentence overturned. They all remain on death row, and at any moment, a new death warrant may be issued. Richard Glossop's execution date was moved to February of this new year, and Wade Lay's was moved to August. There were 2 stays in Alabama, both times because officials were unable to locate a vein in the inmate, and they ran out of time with the death warrant expiring at midnight. Remember that multiple last-minute appeals by lawyers and waiting on court rulings caused those delays. Oklahoma and Texas each had 3 stays, and Tennessee, Georgia, South Carolina, and Idaho each had 1. Now let's talk about the man who says he had nothing to do with the death of his wife.
Yeah, sure. I had nothing to do with my wife's death at all. I've been professing my innocence from the onset.
Yeah, okay, let's see about that. Robert Alan Fratta was born on February 22nd, 1957 in New York, on Long Island. By the early 1980s, he moved to Texas, and sometime around 1982, he met 21-year-old Farah Baquer, who was born in England. Farah had one older brother, and while growing up in England, she and her family did a lot of traveling around the world. By 1981, soon after completing college in the UK, Farah and her parents moved from England to Texas. Farah had always wanted to be a part of the airlines industry, and one day she walked into an airport and approached Robert Fratta, who was at that time working the ticket counter at American Airlines. That is how Farah met Fratta. She requested an employment application and was later hired. Robert Fratta and Farah Baquer worked together for about a year at American Airlines before they began dating. Following a brief courtship, they married and settled into the city of Humble in Texas. Over the years, they had 3 children together: Bradley, Daniel, and then Amber. Financially, they were doing well. Fratta later began working for Missouri City, Texas Public Safety as both a public safety officer and firefighter. But the marriage was said to have always been rocky. However, still loved the charming man she fell for and had always tried to keep their marriage from falling apart. She tried hard to keep the family together, despite Robert Fratta's extremely bad temper and very controlling personality. But by March of the year 1992, Farah could no longer handle the unbearable and intolerable situation that she was in and filed for divorce on the grounds of cruelty. She could no longer endure the physical, emotional, and sexual abuse that Fratta was inflicting on her. Farah had included in the divorce filing, and I hope I don't ruin it for anyone hearing this if you're about to have a meal. Farah stated in the filing that Robert Fratta had recently been insisting that when they have sex, that she also used the bathroom on him. I mean, everything that someone would do into a toilet, he wanted done on him. Farah had also spoken to friends of Fratta's infidelities and frequenting strip clubs, which she was opposed to. Robert Fratta moved out of their home, and divorce proceedings dragged on for almost the next 2 years. During that time, Fratta would continue to grow extremely angry with Farah. He complained to his friends, mostly gym bodybuilding buddies, that he was always broke because of the child support that he was paying. He had also said that he wanted custody of the children so that she would have to pay him, also implying that she has the money because her parents are wealthy. Investigations would later show that at least 7 men from the gym where Robert Fratta worked out had stated that Fratta had been asking about hiring a hitman to kill his wife. Those men would later say that they thought Fratta was just frustrated and blowing off steam, doing so on an almost daily basis, and that he was always referring to Farah by using the B word instead of her name. So they didn't take him seriously, and that's why they never alerted authorities. I'm sorry, but that mentality really bothers me. If just one of those gym buddies of Fratta had done the right thing and alerted police about Fratta, possibly joking around, but saying that he wants to hire a hitman to kill his wife, that murder may have been avoided. Maybe police would have set up an undercover hitman sting operation, such as was done in the case of Dalia DiPolito or Sharon Voigt, and many others. I'm sure you're all familiar with such cases. Finally, a trial date for the divorce was set in family court, scheduled for Monday, November 28th, 1994. By this time, the oldest son, Bradley, was 7 years old. Daniel, the middle child, was 6, and Amber, the youngest, was 4. Today, of course, those 3 children are all grown adults. Notice how all 3 have since changed their last name from Fratta to Baquer, their mother's maiden name, and the last name of their grandparents, who raised them after the death of their mother. Fratta told his friends that he won't win the divorce trial because Farah has the financial backing to win the case and will surely get full custody of the children, something he can't allow to happen. 5 months before that trial date, a masked man broke into Farah's home and assaulted her with a stun gun with the children nearby. The intruder then fled. Farah called 911 and later told a detective how she was sure that her estranged husband had something to do with it. The detective, who knows Robert Fratta well, had believed the same thing. That detective would later say that he confronted Fratta and told him, "I know what you're up to. Leave it alone." But Fratta would not leave it alone. 20 days before the divorce trial, on November 9th, 1994, Robert Fratta and Farah and the children had dinner together at Wyatt's cafeteria. They had made arrangements for Fratta to take the children to St. Mary Magdalene Catholic Church for studies that evening while Farah gets her hair done at the beauty parlor. Witnesses reported, and Fratta's oldest child, Bradley, would later testify in court, that Robert Fratta, during the time that they were in church, was frequently getting beeped on his pager, and he was making phone calls from the church telephone. Bradley's exact words were that his father was on the phone a lot. Telephone records obtained by detectives from the phone company showed that most of those calls were being made to a cell phone registered to a woman named Mary Gipp. During the time that Fratta was in church and Farah was at the beauty parlor, a man named Joseph Prystash, who was also a gym buddy of Robert Fratta, was at home with his girlfriend, Mary Gipp. Mary Gipp, who was going to be charged with murder if she doesn't tell what she knows about the plan to murder Farah, made a deal with the district attorney for immunity, meaning no charges. She then spilled everything she knew, and she knew a lot. Mary Gipp stated that a young man, a neighbor named Howard Guidry, who was 18 years old at the time, met with her boyfriend Joseph Prystash at her home. Prystash had with him her cell phone, Mary Gipp's cell phone, and a gun, and told her that they were headed to Farah's home. In the meantime, Robert Fratta was communicating with Joseph Prystash from the church telephone, informing him of Farah's location and what she was doing. At some point on the way to Farah's home, Joseph Prystash handed Howard Guidry the gun and Mary Gipp's cell phone and dropped him off in front of Farah's house. Prystash then drove away and parked beside a payphone at a nearby grocery store. Howard Guidry had the phone number to that payphone on Mary Gipp's cell phone. It was programmed onto the cell phone during the planning stages. Howard Guidry went over the fence on Farah's property and then around to the side of the parking garage. He then waited near the side door of the garage, the door that Farah would open, taking her on the path to the house. Farah arrived about 8 o'clock in the evening. The remote in the car opened the garage door and she backed in, which is how she usually parked. Farah got out of the car, and when she opened that side door of the garage, Guidry was standing there pointing a gun at her head, and he fired a shot. Farah dropped to the ground beside her car. Guidry was about to leave when he realized that Farah was still alive. He turned around and shot her again in the head. Meanwhile, the neighbors directly across the street heard a scream and 2 gunshots and looked out a window to see Farah dropping to the floor. They immediately called 911. Howard Guidry then used Mary Gipp's cell phone to make a phone call to the payphone by the grocery store and told Prystash it's done. The neighbors across the street remained on the line with 911 and said that a car just pulled up in front of the house and that a black man came running out from the yard and got inside, and the car drove off. Police arrived minutes later, and then paramedics. Someone had contacted Farah's parents, living just a few minutes away, and they rushed over as well. The father, Farah's father, would later say that Farah was barely alive and having convulsions. Farah was rushed to Herman Memorial Hospital, but died soon afterward. Robert Fratta was also contacted, and he left the church with his children. Police and other witnesses later described Fratta as appearing very nonchalant, not distraught or even worried about what just happened. He showed no sadness or surprise. Farah's parents had no doubt that their estranged son-in-law was involved, and detectives thought the same thing. It wasn't a robbery or carjacking or sexual assault. What does that leave? It leaves knowledge of a very messy divorce proceedings and Robert Fratta.
Yeah, sure. I had nothing to do with my wife's death at all. I've been professing my innocence from the onset.
Investigators questioned Robert Fratta at the police station for about 14 hours after the killing, but they had to release him without concrete proof at the moment. The media was outside the police station waiting and caught up with Fratta moments after being released from the police interview. Just hours after Farah, the mother of his children, was brutally killed. He can be seen here hamming it up for the cameras, more concerned about how he looks and appearing to enjoy his moments of fame. While the investigation was ongoing, the grandparents had custody of the children, so Fratta began fighting for custody to get them back and took the grandparents to court. The judge ultimately ruled in favor of the grandparents having custody. Fratta was not happy. Remember that as long as someone else has custody, the child support payments must continue. On the night of the murder, Joseph Prystash and Howard Guidry returned to the apartment complex where they live. Prystash entered his home, and Mary Gipp was there to greet him. According to Mary Gipp, she asked her boyfriend if Farah was dead, and he said yes. She stated in an interview for the media that when she asked him how does he know, that he only said, because I was there. Prystash now had the gun back in his possession again, and he put it away. Joseph Prystash and Mary Gipp, according to her, then had sex. Now here's an interesting part about this. When the boyfriend, Prystash, wasn't looking, Mary Gipp grabbed a piece of paper and a pen. She went to the gun and proceeded to write down the serial number and other information engraved on the gun. It's not clear in any reports why she did that, and when she was asked, why did you copy down the serial number from the gun, she simply answered, I don't know. Personally, I can think of a couple of reasons. Here's where I offer my opinion. Maybe she thought that if things ever get ugly with the whole murder plot, she can use that as a get-out-of-jail-free card. And as it turns out, that is exactly what happened. Another reason might be in the event that if Joseph Prystash ever tried to break up with her, she would use that as leverage to prevent it. What do you think? When detectives got a hold of the phone records showing the calls from the church to Mary Gipp's cell phone, they went to question her, but she refused to say a word. At some point, Joseph Prystash loaned the gun again to Howard Guidry, and on March 1st, 1995, he used it to rob a bank. But Guidry wasn't successful with getting away, and he was captured with the bank's money and the gun. That gun ended up getting stored in a box in an evidence locker room, along with other evidence. Several days later, the DA notified Mary Gipp that with the phone records they have enough to call for a grand jury and charge her with the murder of Farah Baquer. That's when Mary Gipp began talking. She implicated Howard Guidry, who was now locked up on bank robbery charges, and she implicated her boyfriend. She also gave them the piece of paper showing the serial number of the gun she said was used to kill Farah. Detectives put two and two together, returned to the evidence room, and there was the gun that Guidry had used to rob a bank in a box. The gun had the same serial number that Mary Gipp had written on a piece of paper. That's when they decided to run a trace on the serial number. And the owner of the gun, the man who bought the gun, turned out to be none other than Robert Alan Fratta.
Yeah, sure. I had nothing to do with my wife's death at all. I've been professing my innocence from the onset.
Howard Guidry was questioned, and he gave a full confession of every detail regarding the night of the murder. He was even taken for a walkthrough of the crime scene where he explained what happened, and that was video recorded as well. Joseph Prystash was then picked up in a parking lot and taken to the police station. At first, he denied having anything to do with the murder. However, Detective Danny Billingsley took Prystash back to the parking lot where he had been picked up, and at that point, Prystash realized the jig was up and gave Billingsley a full confession that matched exactly with what Howard Guidry had said. Prystash had also said that he was the one who 5 months earlier went into Farah's home and used a stun gun on her. But the detective had already known that because Mary Gipp had already told him about it. Prystash also said that Robert Fratta hired him and gave him the gun that was used to kill Farah. Prystash was later arrested and charged with murder. The next arrest would be the so-called mastermind of the entire plot, Robert Fratta. I say so-called mastermind because it would seem that he planned the whole thing stupidly and made a lot of mistakes. So now, 5 months after the murder, they were all in jail. All except Mary Gipp, who had knowledge of the planning of the murder and was aware of everything going on, but she got the immunity deal from the DA's office, who believed that the prosecutor, Kelly Siegler, very much needed her testimony in court along with the other evidence. Even though Prystash and Guidry had given full confessions to authorities, they later recanted and said that the confessions were coerced by police, and they refused to testify in court against Fratta. Mary Gibb did testify as part of the immunity deal. But at trial, prosecutors would use all the video and audio tape confessions of Howard Guidry and Joseph Prystash's parking lot confession to the detective. And Mary Gibb testified about everything her boyfriend had told her about the plans to murder Farah. However, all that, the two men's confessions and Gibb's testimony, would become a problem for this case 13 years later. I'll get to that in a moment. All three men, Fratta, Prystash, and Guidry, in separate trials, were all convicted of murder, and all of them were sentenced to death. 13 years later, in the year 2007, with Fratta still maintaining his innocence, the Supreme Court threw out Robert Fratta's conviction. Their ruling stated that, according to the Sixth Amendment of the Constitution of the United States, defense attorneys have the right to cross-examine on a witness stand anyone making accusations against their client. The accused shall enjoy the right, among other things, to be confronted with the witnesses against him. It should probably say him or her, but, a document written about 250 years ago. So, because Prystash and Guidry refused to testify, their confessions cannot be presented by the prosecution. Also, much of what Mary Gibb testified to, the things Prystash had told her, was also thrown out as hearsay evidence. 2 years later, in 2009, Robert Fratta was tried again in court. They didn't have the confessions, but they had many of Fratta's gym bodybuilding buddies who say he tried to hire them to kill Farah. They also had the phone records showing the calls to Prystash before, during, and after the murder. They had the gun registered to him that was used to kill Farah. And they had Mary Gibb, who, although was no longer allowed to say what her boyfriend told her, she was able to say what she saw with her own eyes and describe the activities of Joseph Prystash and Howard Guidry the night of the murder. And that was enough to get Robert Fratta convicted again and sentenced to death again.
Yeah, sure. I had nothing to do with my wife's death at all. I've been professing my innocence from the onset.
For the murder of Farah Baquer, Howard Guidry was supposed to get $1,000 in cash. Joseph Prystash was supposed to get a couple $1,000s and a Jeep. And all this because a man did not want to pay child support. Bradley, Daniel, and Amber were raised by their grandparents after the death of their mother and father's imprisonment. The children don't engage in any contact with their father, who they refer to as Bob. A decision was made to have Farah's birth name, Farah Baquer, on her gravestone instead of Fratta. Most would probably agree of that having been a very good decision. Please remember to subscribe for more death row and upcoming execution stories. I'm Paco Rivera. Bye for now.